the idea is, as soon as you say that, as soon as you buy into that whole thing that there is a politically correct, I mean, the phrase itself draws the line. You're saying this is politically correct.
Yeah, I think the idea was of the term, what most people thought it was at least, was just a correct way to not necessarily police what you're saying, but, just a politely mannered way of phrasing things. But what it's evolved to, and I think what its intent was, since the term was coined, was to police what you can and can't say, so you can't have political dissidents. You can't have these enemies speak out against you because they're just not allowed to say that.
Welcome to the Generation Zion podcast with Todd and David. Together, they discuss the war against God in the world today.
Hello and welcome to the second episode of Generation Zion. I am David.
And I'm Todd.
So today we're going to be talking about the evolution of politics. So I am still young. I'm Generation Z. Todd,
I'm Generation X.
Yes, the silent generation, right?
Yeah, you know what? I feel like maybe we've been silenced, but we didn't start off silent.
I think the term silent generation comes from the generation that just didn't say a lot. They just kind of sat there and lived through it and just, rolled with the punches. That's how my dad put it when I talked to him. He's Gen X. But, with all the boomers, what they did to the economy, introducing credit scores, Generation X was the beginning of a political experiment, really. Not just in politics in general, like speaking about our government, but politics as a definition. Just decision-making in general, in law, in finance, in everything. Because you saw these new rules and laws come out from the boomers generation, introduced into Generation X's, and they just kind of had to live with it. And they were like, no one really said anything until, I feel like now is when people are really recognizing it. All these new policies that the boomers introduced to them. So, you got anything?
Well, you know what? I think of it as the silent generation. I think you're right in what you've been saying. I almost feel like the Generation Y has been the silent generation, but I think we've been silenced, because here's the thing, is that when I was starting off in my adulthood, so all through high school, rock and roll was still king. Rock and roll was out there, and rock and roll is always about being an individualist. And UBU was in the late 80s and maybe even early 90s. I think it was a marketing slogan for like Reebok or Nike at one point, and it was UBU, and everybody had to be individual. Everybody had to make their own noise. So it wasn't that everybody talked the same. I feel like the boomers tend to all speak in the same way, whereas with Generation X, it was all about making your own noise. So it was about this collective noise they were making. The problem is that somewhere along the line, we've been silenced rather than being silent to begin with. I don't understand my generation. I don't understand why we have been cowed into being silent or kind of going along with some of the stuff that in our high school years we would have been right against, because punk rock was still there. The spirit of punk rock. Punk rock came out in the mid to the late 70s. But it still was there, because even though it wasn't, I don't know how big it was in general, but punk rock had its imprint on us.
Yeah,
and we all wanted to go out and sort of be punk rockers.
Right, and punk rock, I think the whole, not just like as a genre of music, it was like be against authority, speak out against authority, be your own person, like you said. And I think that ideal has transferred over to millennials, really. I don't see Generation Z adopting it as much, but that ideal definitely evolved, or devolved really, to the millennials, and they kind of adopted it, not really as this punk will never die kind of thing, but just the spirit of it, really.
Well, I even think if you look at the punk rock of the 2000s, is that was a different type of punk rock than the punk rock that I knew of. I mean, the Clash was one of those classic punk bands, and it still was into the 80s. So, just as an idea, I went to high school from 80 to 84, 84 to 88, 84 to 88, and the Clash was still around. The Police were still around, even though they were kind of thought as fake punk rockers. But there was a lot of people, and then it was like in the 90s when like Green Day came out and other bands. And the reason I'm talking about rock music like this is because it was, like you said, it was more than just music. It was a lifestyle, an ethos of sorts, of being rock and standing up for yourself and being individualistic. And my generation started like that.
And there were a lot of Christians against that, like Puritists, really, Puritans, especially. But regular Christians were like against all that, punk rock stuff in general.
They were because.
And do you think that like kind of started creating a split between like music and Christianity, or does it go back further?
No, no. See, the thing is that in my high school years, like Christian rock kind of really came into its own, and then there were Christian punk bands, and
really
they weren't necessarily well known at that point. They kind of more solidified in the 90s, and there were punk bands, and I'm sure that there are Christian punk bands, but again, the punk bands that you think of, and Green Day probably was the last real punk band that was widely known. After that, some of the other punk, quote unquote punks, were really like emo, new emo stuff.
How does that work exactly, like a Christian punk band? I'm getting a little off.
That's right.
Here already, but
no, but this feeds into all of how the world was working at the time. With Christian punk bands, it wasn't. It was more like that was based on the music first off, and they loved loud thrashing music.
Right, and punk is like based off of like disregarding authority, and most people view God as an authoritative figure. So how does that work lyrically speaking? Like, what did they sing about exactly?
It was more like, and I'm trying to think of some songs that would be applicable, but the idea would be more like, instead of being God as the authority you rebelled against, it was the god of this world, Satan, that you rebelled against. First off,
okay,
or this was, I think, even more relevant to us, is that it was at the time when there were a lot of these grand televangelists this is when televangelism really took hold, right? So is that like what we do today with like recording our sermons and things like that? Well,
is that what
the televangelists were people like, some of the televangelists are still around, some aren't. Jim Bakker was one. He was a televangelist to some extent. He was a different type, but Jimmy Swagger was a big televangelist. There was a guy named Ernest Angsley we used to make fun of all the time in my high school. And really it was them using kind of the Billy Graham evangelistic model on TV. The problem with all of that is that they were shiny, flashy. Obviously, there was this feeling that you got that later on we kind of got confirmed that it was about the money. It was a flim-flam. They were out to sucker people, particularly older people who would be suckered. So punk bands might rage against that.
So against like the people that are in it for the money. You even see that today. Like, I feel like it's been like throughout all of history since Jesus was born. Like, I think you could say it even began when Jesus went to the church and whipped all those guys that were trading in the church. They were in it for the money. They were using the house of God for marketing and trading and money in general. I know it still happens today. People are just using the word of God to extort money from Christians. And it's really effective because the better of a public speaker you are, really, or the better versed you are in the word, you don't have to be Christian. You just have to know it and sound convincing enough to make people give you their money. And the sad part is a lot of people fall for it under a false guise of goodness. Like, all this money is going to go to charity, or we're going to feed all these poor people, but they're just taking all the money for themselves. And people fall for that all the time. And it's disappointing, and I hate that it happens.
Absolutely. But I think part of it, too, is the fact that there are a lot of pastors, preachers, evangelists, we'll just call them, that what they do is they set themselves up as the prophet of God. They may not use those terms, but they set themselves up as such. So what happens is they set themselves up to say, what I'm saying came right from God. Like, they just went to the mountain and they're just back with, here's what God just told me and I'm telling you this. And what happens is that a lot of people are suckered into thinking that, oh, God must be talking to me from that person. And it happens in small churches, it happens in mega churches. And so you see this where people then feel that it's their spiritual duty to give money. It's their spiritual duty to do this, to give some kind of obeisance to these people. And that suckers them in many times. So going back to like the rock music, is that those were the kind of authorities. Those were the kind of authorities that we raged against even in the church. So you saw people, one of my favorites, and wasn't necessarily punk, but he had the ethic of punk about him. His name was Steve Taylor. Fantastic, and he raged against all the Christian phonies in there. He's fantastic. He's still recording today, and he was somebody who really created art as well, and that was something that was truly different. But the idea about this was that my generation said, we're going to speak out against everything. We kind of inherited some of the 60s mentality, but it got filtered through the 70s, and then in the 80s, it was about your individual rock. I'm standing up and I'm telling you this, and if you're bad authority, I'm going to be against you. I think that we were many times more reasonable than the 60s hippies, because at that point, there was a certain point back then when they were like, don't trust anybody over 30, right? For us, it was in some senses, like if you're over 30, you still may be cool. But in a sense, it's like, we almost had it where you don't trust anybody unless they earn your trust. You know, it was that kind of thing. So I think there was a reasonableness that our trust could be earned by these people. But if you didn't, we're going to rage against you, or not rage, because that was a stupid term that came up later. But we're going to speak out against you, and we're not going to just follow because you guy in the polyester suit and the slick back hair with the Bible in his hand and be out the pulpit. Just because you're there, we're not going to do what you say. We want to do what God said. So from a Christian 80s point of view, I think it was more along those lines rather than anything else, at least from my perspective.
So a lot to unpack there. So I just want to backpedal just a little bit, like not speaking out.
Not speaking out, because a lot of people have been brainwashed into thinking that if they say anything against a pastor or a preacher, then therefore they're somehow saying against God. It's not unlike Fauci saying, you know, I am science, you know, that kind of whatever he said. It's not unlike that kind of thing, because they almost put themselves in the place of God. You know, I preach at this church here, and I tell people, look, I spend time studying, praying about this, going through and preparing my sermons, but I am not giving you, the Holy Spirit's not dictating my sermon out of me. It gives me wisdom along the way. It gives me wisdom as I'm speaking. Sometimes I might say things or not say something because I'm feeling, okay, this is how it should be. But I don't think they earn their trust. See, I don't think they earn their trust. I think that they snooker people. That's different. People many times these days think that they've got to blindly trust. They think that's what trust is. But it's not.
And I think a lot of these false prophets just are easily manipulate people that don't actually read the text in between the lines, especially because I think it's highlighted a few different times in the Bible. I haven't read through it in a while now. I need to reread my Bible because it's been years. I'm guilty of that as well, as a lot of these people are. They don't read between the lines. They don't actually study the word, and they allow themselves to be duped and manipulated by these people because they forget to be wary of false prophets.
Exactly.
And these people calling themselves prophets, maybe not directly, but indirectly, really, by saying, hey, I got this word from God the other day. He sent me a text message in my brain, kind of thing. And they just let themselves get duped by that. And I think most people think they'll say it directly to you. They'll say, hey, I'm a prophet of God, and I'm here to give you the word that he gave me. And that's where people really get tricked, because some people really just need you to tell them directly, and they just can't think for themselves.
Well, the thing is, Acts 17, the Apostle Paul goes to the church in Berea, and it details in there this specific thing, saying that the people at Berea searched the scriptures to see if what Paul was saying was true, and they were praised for doing this. And what blows most people's minds when they sit down and think about it, this is the Apostle Paul going to these people. So anybody you would think would be like, well, Apostle Paul says it, it's got to be true. But no, the Bereans searched the scriptures to see if what he was saying was true. And again, they were praised for it. They were not castigated for it by saying, oh, you should have believed it because it was Paul. That's one of the biggest problems. People don't even necessarily read the lines, let alone between the lines,
So that comes down to just not having access to a lot of old texts and scriptures. Like, the Catholic Church removed a lot of books from the Bible alone. I have a old 18th century Bible. I'll show you that one. I think I did show it to you. I'm not sure.
You told me about it.
Yeah, I do have it. It's an old Catholic Bible, and it has almost every single book that was removed from it from then till when it was made till now. And I know that a lot of books were removed because they had a lot of research put into it, a lot of old scriptures pulled up to verify. But I think one of the really important ones that I removed is, and we can talk about this later because it's off topic, is the book of Judas. And a lot of people bring that up because they say that God told Judas he would have to betray Jesus. That's what he has to do because you have to fulfill the prophecy. And I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but I just want to look through it and verify that. But again, I don't know if it's really set in stone, that whole book, because it was removed. And again, a lot of them were removed because they're just not trustworthy sources of information. And I still even can't confirm that or not, if it was just removed because the Catholic Church wanted to manipulate people. Not to say that they do. I mean, they definitely did back then. There were a lot of bad people in the church. Even today, there's a lot of evil people in the church. I think I read a article, to get us back on track, article, I think it was written in the 60s, about communists getting into the Catholic Church and putting out their rhetoric through the Word of God and twisting it to turn people communists, really, and make the church look bad as well.
Well, that fits with something that a woman named Bella Dodd has claimed. And Bella Dodd, if you read Schools of Darkness or School of Darkness, it's one of the two. It has, for her, she was a former Catholic, and that eventually became a communist, part of the Communist Party, and she became some kind of leader within the Communist Party. I have the book. I read the book actually a few months ago. But one of the things that she claimed is that they the Communist Party infiltrated the Catholic Church by sending in people who would become priests, and then obviously you become priests, and at some point you can keep moving up, become cardinals or bishops. I have no idea. I really am not extremely well versed on the whole Catholic thing necessarily. I know some of the stuff.
Yeah, Catholicism, I personally believe now, being a former Catholic, that it was used as a way to, just based on what I've studied, it was a way to get pagans to convert to Christianity. You can still do all these rituals and you can do all these practices, but it has to be in the name of our God now. It has to be in the name of Christ. And that really did bring a lot of people over, because it was like the thing back then to be pagan. I mean, I feel like it's making a turn today as well, especially with Norse pagans. I actually work with a Norse pagan. He's an interesting fellow.
So he prays to Odin.
I think he has Thor amulet or whatever. He wears it. I think it's kind of lame, but do your own thing. Eventually, you'll come to God, anyways. Hopefully.
Well, yeah, hopefully. But this was the mentality of my generation. Came out of the 80s with the idea that we were going to make our own way in the world. We were going to fight for truth, justice, and at that point, it was still the American way. The American way was broader, was maybe in the middle of its dilution. The whole idea of America was still that America did some bad things, but America was still America. And if we could just, take care of those bad things, then America still was a good thing. Nowadays, that's no longer the case. But we were very much about being individuals and having our own voice.
Yeah, and millennials really adopted that idea, especially leftists, I think. And not that that's a bad thing, having your own voice. I think it really started with leftism, though, in the left. I think that's where it started, because I think growing up, conservatives were really like one-minded, one path. And you see that creates a lot of infighting in both parties, really. And you see that especially in the left, especially with I think there's a group called Gays Against Groomers. They call it's funny because the acronym is GAG.
I follow them on Twitter.
Oh, really? They made a post on Twitter about a billboard they were going to put up against transgenderism, and that transgenderism is inherently leftist. So it's creating a lot of infighting in that group. And you could say that you can be a homosexual and be a right winger as well. But it's more like those ideals are more concentrated on the left, so that would create a lot more infighting with them. And that really affects who they get in political positions and whatnot. But back to 80s activism and individualism, there were a lot of people getting together and going to protest. Would you say that it would be the same across the board for both left and right in that time, or was it still mostly leftist?
I would say protests were mostly leftist. I think that the type of protests, when you think of protests, you think of more. I would say they tend to be more leftist.
I'm talking the go out there, raise a sign in front of a Capitol building or State House or something, and.
But I would say that the things they protested were more larger issues. I can't remember what year it started, but when Farm Aid started.
Mm-hmm.
Farm Aid started because it was to support the American farmer, and they felt that the Republicans had been really setting up a lot of policies that would harm the farmers. So it was for farming. It was for this type of thing.
Could you elaborate on what that is for those who don't know what it is?
What
Farm Aid, yeah.
Farm Aid? Well, Farm Aid essentially was just a big concert that raised money for to benefit the farmers. Now, I have no idea how much it actually benefited farmers because, unfortunately, because before that there was Live Aid. Live Aid came out in the mid '80s, and Live Aid was a big, this big concert. It was a very huge, famous concert. It was the Woodstock of the '80s. Woodstock was the big '60s concert.
Right.
This was the Woodstock of the '80s, where you had things going on in Philly and a big concert in Philly and one in London, and they were going ahead. Like all the big names were doing, and it was to raise money for Africa, for the famine in Africa.
Yeah, I probably didn't actually get a lot of money going to there because you got to pay for the venue, you have to pay for all the people going.
Yeah. I mean, they raised a lot of money, and I think there was money that made its way to Africa. The problems on the other side may have been political, as well as some of these things, may not have been all that they were cracked up to be. But again, you painted this big picture of like, oh, we want to help Africa, and there's starvation in Africa, the famine in Africa. So you had this. There was a big song to raise money called "We Are the World," and that was a huge song.
I wouldn't say that's inherently leftist at all. I think that could be more. Yeah, that would involve both sides, really. Anyone who's a humanitarian, really.
Absolutely.
That's not isolated to the left.
Absolutely. But that was prompted by people who would refer to themselves as being on the left. And while people on the right may want to, again, be part of that whole thing, it wasn't necessarily even a protest, as that was a big money maker, raising money for charity. But most of the protests that I remember were more of those along the lines of these bigger ideas, and rather than, like, we wouldn't necessarily see protests for speakers that were coming to universities, for example, and we're going to protest this. It was, for us, part of the rock and roll mentality in the 80s was still about free speech. That was what we were fighting for, because a lot of people felt that the Reagan era, the Bush, picking up at the end of that, and all that, the Republicans were against free speech. They were, again, the Puritans who didn't want to, you can't say this, you can't say that. Mm-hmm. And so we were all about, as a group, but it was all multiple voices. I think one of the biggest differences I see now is that there is the same voice. Every time I see a protest now, it's the same chants that are going. It's the same thing. You have to say these things. You have to do these things. And the thing is where I see the pivot point for all of this from my own life is the mid-90s. And that was the true ascendancy of political correctness.
So basically, back in the 80s, there wasn't as much political division. Most people got together. Even people who claimed to be leftists and would describe themselves as that made these huge events that would get money for a cause that pretty much a lot of people cared about on both sides. Yeah. So there was no really, like, you believe in this if you're leftist, you believe in that. Obviously, there still was, like, on big issues. But I think today, even, you could divide each other with even smaller issues. Just this, supporting something smaller would either make you leftist, make you conservative, or a far right winger, a Nazi, socialist, whatever. Because
Absolutely.
Even traditional Democrats are getting pushed to the right because they support the right to bear arms, and traditional Democrats back then did support that. But today you can't support gay rights and, like, guns at the same time, like, at least as a huge political figure, because the majority on the left are against that. So it's this little thing that you might support that they push you away because you don't like that thing. And that's besides the fact that leftists are arming themselves now. They still hate guns at the same time. They only want cops to have guns, but they still hate cops. It's just a whole thing.
There's a lot
of contradictory beliefs on the left, and I find it hilarious.
Well, when I was growing up, we didn't think of as leftists. They were leftists many times, at least in the United States. There may have been leftists like in other countries, Central American countries. You had certain things that were leftists or right wing. They were kind of separated more in other countries.
Right, and you wouldn't even see the term liberal being thrown around back then, would you?
Well, you would.
You would? When was that term coined?
You would. Well, that term goes back a long way because the classical liberal was what you think of conservative now.
Okay.
Right? So, but back then, you wouldn't call someone a leftist. You might refer to someone as liberal. But back then, you would see a fence, right? There would be a fence, and on one side of it would be Republicans. On the other side would be Democrats. And yeah, there would be that fence in between. But basically, they could still be neighbors leaning over the fence, talking to each other.
And now it's a huge concrete wall.
Yeah, now it's separated. Now it's been going. And you're absolutely right that the traditional Democrats, the people that we would think of as liberals in my youth, would be now really on the other side of the fence.
So liberal back then was more, and I can see why, the literal definition of liberal, which means you're just okay with like a ton of things. Basically what libertarians are now, right?
Well, like, maybe to some extent.
Like the type of libertarian, like I support gay couples defending their weed farm with AR-15s, that kind of libertarian, basically.
Well, some of the Democrats won't even really necessarily be at that point. But the idea of liberal was just a tag, and conservative and liberal was just the tag that went with Republican and Democrat at that point. But it was a friendlier thing. And like I said, they would be on opposite sides of this ideological fence, but they still would be neighbors who could lean against the fence and talk to each other.
Because I think back then there's ideals didn't cause life-changing effects for the other side. Like using the fence analogy, if I built a radio tower in my backyard, that's going to affect my neighbor's property value. It's like huge problems now that create this division that are going to affect the other side, whether it passes or not.
Well, I think back then you could have a reasonable conversation with each other, and people were reasonable. And people who I grew up in a family that was Republican, and you could have a Democrat neighbor, but it would be they're reasonable people. They may think that raising taxes would be a good thing to help out with the general economy, and they may be for some kind of foreign policy, but generally they were, there was a lot of general agreement, just differences on tactics or differences on strategies of how you go about it. But a lot of times back then, people were proud of America. People would consider themselves proud Americans, and they would be able to shake hands and know that they could shake hands with good consciences, even though they voted differently. That was not what it is now, and that is where it became leftist. And I think, again, going back, the rise of the popularization of political correctness was the key.
I think that tax one is a really great example, because back then taxes didn't really affect people as much as they do now. So if you're a leftist supporting increasing taxes now to help group A, B, and C, obviously a lot of people on the right are going to be against that, because taxes are just so taxing now.
Yeah.
And I think, you could agree with them or agree to disagree and be like, well, I don't support, raising our taxes to fund this cause, but it's not really going to hurt me and I can still live the way I am today if that bill passes and all that money gets to this group or the social program. But there's just so many social programs today that just aren't working, and all of our tax dollars, $40 million to Ukraine, you gotta pay 25% taxes now because Ukraine needs money, and a lot of people are going to be against that now because they can't live the same way they were back then, and your income can change on a dime these days.
Mm-hmm.
Literally.
It's very true. It's very true. But the thing is taxes back then were, I think they thought differently about them in some ways. They still were taxes, and it really was dependent on, well, we want to help these people out over here. And again, the economic differences were slighter. They might have been, like I said, there was a fence there. They were on there, but there again,
there wasn't as much as a class gap as there is today.
Right, and that, but I'm not here. The thing is that today, I don't know if we know exactly what that gap actually is. I'm not saying there's not a gap or that it's not wider, but I think that there's been so much misinformation by administrations, both Republican and Democrat, that we don't know actually what it is. Because I think nowadays the leftism doesn't have anything to do with Republican or Democrat. Right now, it's essentially Republican and Democrats are two wings of the same bird now. So the encroaching fascism, as people love to throw out without even knowing what that means, but the encroaching fascism that the left talked about, like with the Bush era, a lot of people thought, well, okay, we got to do this for protection when the Patriot Act came out. And at that point, there was so much division in there that I think a lot of the right did not think clearly about the Patriot Act because they were snookered. A lot of the people who voted for it were people of my age on up who still thought reasonably. But the Bush administration putting through that Patriot Act was a complete treacherous thing that the right should have come completely against.
Right, but at the time, the thought was, oh, we need this because, we just got attacked, so...
Problem, reaction, solution. We want to have the solution being we want to have more control. We want to have more surveillance. We want to have these type of things, therefore... And you can go into what the attack, the true nature of the attack, and that's a whole nother conversation.
God, I want 9/11 as a whole thing.
Yeah, it's a whole other conversation.
There's so much you can talk about on that. Like, was it an inside job? Was it not? There's just so much there. We could have a whole episode on just 9/11 alone.
We can certainly do that.
I'll even write that down.
But what you have though is that many times at that point, the left and right were so far apart. The gap had widened there. Forget about the wage gap, the income gap. The gap had widened so far.
Do you think it's just because of the Patriot Act, though? Because
No. I think the Patriot Act is a milestone you can point to say.
Just as an example, like the tax analogy.
Yeah, it was a milestone that came in, and a lot of the left were rightly against it, but they were against it because the Bush administration was proposing it. And therefore, they've gotten, and quite frankly, it was the politicians who had done this little manipulation. They were the new televangelists who were suckering people, and so the left was totally against it, rightly so. And so the right was like, well, if the left is against it, I'm going to vote for it.
Yeah,
and there was no longer reasonable thought.
And I forgot who said this, but someone made a great point. I was talking to someone before, and I don't know if they probably didn't come up with this, but we were having a conversation, and the term politics is the new religion came up. And in a way, it absolutely is. People will quite literally worship who they support.
Absolutely.
And they can do no wrong. Especially with this administration right now. I'm not going to say a lot about it because I don't want to get zucked. But you can do no wrong. Even if you don't fulfill your campaign promises, you can't do anything wrong. And they'll see so much happen and all this crap, and they just keep on pushing for this person because they're not the bad guy.
Well, it happened in the previous administration too. There was a religious,
absolutely,
religious kind of quality about that whole thing, and there's still is.
Trump. People absolutely
they want a second coming. They want a second. I mean, they always talk about it that way. I've seen some very weird things that people put out about Trump and comparing him to Jesus.
Oh, yeah.
And it's just very weird. Whether you like what his policies or not, we've gotten to that point where you're absolutely right. Politics has become this weird religion. I don't know if politics was religion back in my day. Politics may have been really inherent to what your life was because, hey, I'm a Republican, I'm a Democrat. But it was not this weird religion like it's become.
Well, I think people compare like Trump to Jesus as an example because more Christians are right wing. I think it's just inherently right wing like religion, and you can just see that. I can't really speak for Christianity as a whole, but you see more Christians on the right, and if leftists had their own Jesus in quotes, can't see my fingers on a podcast, but if they had their own Jesus, I think they would compare Biden to that, their Jesus.
Well, I think their Jesus was Obama. I do. I think their Jesus was Obama, and so I think the halo effect, and quite frankly, it was, if Trump wasn't there, I don't think that Biden by himself would have as much of this glow to him. But I think a lot of it was the halo effect from his connection to Obama, but at the same time, you got to go against that guy, which is the Trump, and a lot of times nowadays, the knee-jerk reaction. Anytime you have that knee-jerk reaction, you got to go against that guy because it's their guy. Then you've lost that kind of reasonable kind of quality to your thinking and quality to the conversation.
I think a lot of people are beyond reason today. You see that. Vote blue no matter who.
And I think that's it's all by design. I mean, I really do. I think so. Going back to the 90s, right? So here's where I see this pivot point. Is you started to hear about this term called politically correct, the political correctness, which is a weird thing for people to adopt who wouldn't or normally adopt it, right? So it was not a new term in the 90s, but it kind of reaches its popularity in the 90s. That's where it kind of ascended to. It was started to be talked about at the end of the 80s, but it's a term that goes back to the Marxist-Leninist days. It was used actually during the Hitlerian days and after, with the idea that there's one correct political way to think. And if you're going to be on the quote-unquote, and I'm doing air quotes now, right side of history, then you've got to believe this way, you've got to talk this way, you've got to espouse this. So in the mid-90s is when you heard political correctness be widely used. It was before it was used in America in more niche ways. But it was widely used, and it was used from the top. You heard, I don't know if you heard Bill Clinton. I remember Hillary Clinton talking about it. I remember her talking about this. The idea is, as soon as you say that, as soon as you buy into that whole thing, that there is a politically correct. I mean, the phrase itself draws the line. You're saying this is politically correct.
Yeah, I think the idea was of the term, what most people thought it was at least, was just a correct way to not necessarily police what you're saying, but, just a politely mannered way of phrasing things. But what it's evolved to, and I think what its intent was, since the term was coined, was to police what you can and can't say, so you can't have political dissidents. You can't have these enemies speak out against you because they're just not allowed to say that.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right in how you put all that. I think it's a clever but unfair rhetorical device to sneak into something, because as soon as you brand something as politically correct, again, you've drawn the line. So if somebody doesn't say it the way you say it, therefore they're politically incorrect, and that's a very leftist way to think. Because if you remember, I think we mentioned this about Alinsky in the last episode, where Alinsky was all about drawing that line, and you had to polarize them. So we're right, you're wrong. And when I also mentioned Lakoff, I don't know if I mentioned Lakoff in this Little Blue book, but when he talks about all politics are moral, like there's moral quality to all politics, you have to draw the line. What that means is that once you draw that line, what you believe is good, what they believe is evil. It's no longer a difference of opinion. It's no longer two neighbors being able to lean against the fence and discuss how much taxes should be done. It's now, I believe in good, you believe in evil. And so that's where political correctness was now used as a tool by saying this is politically correct. And excuse me, they made fun of it many times. In fact, there was a book that came out, I remember, called Politically Correct Bedtime Stories, and it was just all fairy tales that were redone as if they were politically correct. And it was a
So they just took
comic
like
book.
Disney stories and multiplied it by 10. Right?
Yeah, it was, like Cinderella, or, it was Little Red Riding Hood and Six Bad Wolf. And what they did is, the way they described them was all, quote unquote, politically correct. Because then it became, that's where you started to hear terms like, even like, oh, there's something impaired. And so people would be saying, like, I'm height impaired. Like, they would be something that would be impaired. Like, I'm vision, I'm not blind, I'm vision impaired. And so to say that kind of blind was no longer acceptable, I'm no longer deaf, I'm hearing impaired. Some of those things sounded very neutral. Like the two items I gave you right there sounded very neutral. But it started going, all of these things started going along the lines where you couldn't call them by their old names, you couldn't use their old terms. You had to now use this neutral term. You had to use what would essentially be their version of gender neutral terms, as well as that's when the rise of African American came up too. That really was when it really reached its peak. During the 90s is when they were no longer considered black. They would be termed African American. That was the new politically correct way of describing someone.
It's funny you bring that up because if you're blind, you can't even say you're blind now. It feels like if you're talking to like certain people, like, oh, you can't say that. You don't say visually impaired, or you can't say someone has a speech impairment. You can't call someone, and I understand for the word retarded. You can't just call people retarded anymore. I wouldn't, go around calling people. I mean, sometimes, but generally, I don't go around calling people retarded because it's just not a word that a lot of people use to describe slow people anymore. They say they're a little. What would the correct term be for?
Well, when I was working in the 90s, I was working with that population that used to be called retarded. And retarded is an actual English word. That's the thing. It means to slow down. That you retard something, you're slowing something down.
Right, yeah, and it's a Latin root, and it's used in French too. I forget how they say it in French. I think it's just literally just retard, and they say in a French accent, retard, or whatever.
Yeah, it very well could be. Well, we called them, for example, we were told that we were supposed to call them, we couldn't call them handicapped anymore. We couldn't even call them handicapped. We had to call them developmentally disabled.
Developmentally disabled.
Or developmentally delayed. And I personally have a beef with the use of disabled. Particularly for people mentally challenged many times, and I just use air quotes again. But those were the terms you could use. But I worked in a deaf school, and you could not say deaf and dumb because that was pejorative. Hearing impaired is what you had to say, which was fine, and they were hearing impaired. But what people don't understand is even the phrase deaf and dumb, because along the way the word dumb became equal to stupid. That's what it meant. People thought you were saying that they were deaf and stupid. That is not even what the word dumb originally meant. Dumb meant that you couldn't speak. It was basically the same thing as saying mute. And that along the lines, you couldn't say these type of things. So no longer, you had to come up, and this was one of the problems. When I started, it was all of these things, because I worked with that population from 91 through 96. And the terms even changed along the way, because now this new thing, that's where you started to see that political correctness wasn't even a kinder way of saying something. It was now a fluid way of saying something, and things now had to, if they were branded politically correct, you now had to speak it that way. You could not use the other term. Even if the other term was as neutral as the one you were given, you couldn't say it.
So do you think that those terms only became derogatory because they let it become derogatory?
Well, I think, like, for example, deaf and dumb. I think dumb, most people know dumb by the idea of being stupid. And it became derogatory much sooner than the political correctness wave. But I think that one right there, language does evolve. And so I have some amount of sympathy for when the word dumb became just a term for stupid as opposed to mute. Then I understand that you don't want people to think that you're saying that somebody's stupid, but I'd rather reclaim those words rather than just say, well, we can't use that word because people think it's stupid. I'd rather reclaim the word. And it's amazing how the atmosphere of political correctness creates this fear, this anxiety that, oh, what am I supposed to say? It made everybody like, which word am I supposed to say now? And there were times when I saw people absolutely afraid to use the word again, black. That's really the main race that I heard something like Asian American came in, but with Asian Americans, they're very much more distinct. Like if you think of Africa, you nowadays, if you know Nigerians, you might be able to say, oh, I know that, especially by their name, that's they're Nigerian. But it was very difficult for your average American to be able to differentiate between those who are Nigerian and those who may be from the Congo or Chad or those different areas along there to make those kind of distinctions. Whereas with Asian folk, you might say, well, this person's from Japan, this person's from China, this person's from Korea. There was a distinction there, but the politically correct term was Asian American. So, but the key is that you had this anxiety, like, what am I supposed to call them? You still have it today, even now. I mean, it's just ramped up even more. But that's when it started. It reached its peak, and I would say started maybe like in the late 80s when we became popularized. I mean, it's just been sort of the idea of political correctness, but as a institution of speech for America, late 80s, and then hit its stride, I would say 93, 94.
I think it really depends on who you're talking to. If you're talking to someone who's not, to be politically correct, intellectually challenged, you can just say the words like, oh, he's Asian, he's black. You can describe that to the person. If you're describing a person to someone else, for example. Like, it just depends on who you're talking to, I guess. But from a political perspective, it feels like you just have to say those things no matter who you're talking to, especially if it's in public.
Mm-hmm.
Because then you give someone an opportunity to take what you're saying and twist it.
Oh, absolutely. And the leftist tactic is to twist whatever they can. Sometimes you don't even have to say those things, and they can twist it. And so that's part of the problem with doing that dance is, even if you don't really do that dance, or whether you do that dance or not, if somebody wants to twist your words, they will twist your words and even lie. They might even completely outright lie about what you said, even if there's video or audio proof, and all they have to do is lie and besmirch you. It's sort of like there are certain lies that if somebody spreads about you, even if you are completely innocent, even if you are completely exonerated, that lie will still stick to you no matter what.
Yeah, who is that? Bulldog. Right.
Where was he?
He was running. He's here.
Oh,
he lives here.
Oh, New Hampshire. Okay.
Yes. I should have been more specific, but he was running in New Hampshire. I think he was running for governor, right? And Maggie Hassan made a really good smear campaign against him, and basically the ad said, it took like what he said and twisted it, like you said earlier, and what basically was the woman who want to get an abortion or got raped or something, just get over it. And that's basically what they ran with. And I think that really had a huge, it took a huge hit to him because he was not running any campaign against her. He was very, a lot more professional about his campaign than she was, I think. And that really, I mean, did she get elected? I should probably stay more versed in who my government officials are, but I'm not sure. Because
she did. And the thing is, there have always been...
It was senator. It was senator. I apologize. It was not governor. It was senator.
But there have always been political dirty tricks from the beginning of this country. And you know, the fact of the matter is, there have been times when the gulf between opposing parties have been wider than other times. And then you go back to the beginning of this country, and I mean, there were some really dirty tricks and a lot of real smear campaigns that went on in our founding fathers in that era.
I think he didn't run it because he's completely new to politics. He was usually the guy that, you know, took orders from the top. I mean, eventually he was at the top, but for most of his military career, he just took orders and he didn't really talk down to anyone. So he didn't really have that idea in his head that he has to. I don't think you necessarily have to win a campaign, but it plays a huge part to get people to come over to your side if you can take what someone says and twist it. And I think that really helps leftists a lot because they don't have they just don't have that moral foundation. And that goes without saying. People on the right too, I have to say it, you know, people on the right, some people don't have a moral foundation. But I think with a lot of right-wingers being Christian, they have that moral foundation, what you can and can't do. And I think on the left, it's a lot more, to use the literal term, liberal with what you can and can't do, politically speaking, to get what you want. Because they just don't have that moral foundation.
Well, not only is it that moral, that kind of conscience about what you would do, but many times on the left, the whole leftist mentality being the ends justifying the means. And I'm talking about the leftists. I'm not necessarily talking about any individual who might be Democrat, but the leftist mentality is the ends justify the means. So many times, not only do you not have a conscience, but your conscience is actually soothed by the fact of, as long as I get into office and as long as I can further these leftist policies, or you might not even call them leftist policies. You might actually buy into it and just think these are good policies. Then it doesn't matter. Whatever I do here is worth getting into office. So it's a good thing then that I do these things because the policies getting pushed are going to be worth whatever I do to get there. So it actually becomes a skewed kind of morality where doing evil is actually for good because the ends
justify the means. And they do this all the time, and just goes back to having a moral foundation. Like Christians, I don't think if I ran for office, I would ever run a smear campaign against who I'm running against, because I don't mean to toot my own horn, but I just have some semblance of self-respect for myself. I don't want to make myself look like a bad person, and I just don't think they care, because the people on their side don't care what they do to get there, but on the right, they care. I think they care about what their politician looks like, and that's part of the problem, I believe. I don't want to say go out of your way, politicians, and smear campaigns against your enemies, but it's you pander to who you're arguing with. Like, for example, if you bring up mass immigration, and that's a huge problem in this country right now, bringing in millions of illegal immigrants, and you speak out against it, and you're talking to a leftist, they're gonna say, "Oh, you're just racist," and you go and say, "Oh, I'm not racist. I have like 10 Mexican friends," and as soon as you start pandering to them and trying to morally justify yourself, I think you've lost that argument, because you're just pandering to them, and you just completely derails your own argument. And that doesn't mean just say, "Oh yeah, I am racist. I hate Mexicans. I fucking hate those guys. Send them back, every single one." But you have to stand your ground, and I don't think a lot of people do that when they argue.
No, and I think that's why a lot of people really love Donald Trump, because he would stand his ground.
Mm-hmm.
He wasn't cowed by their attacks on him. In fact, he was so good at what he did that he just, they would send a volley towards him and he would just hit it right back at them without necessarily having to smear them or to try that. He
absolutely smears them, like,
but he
Sleepy Joe.
But he didn't even have to smear them, though. I mean, honestly, he can just point those out. Now, not saying that he didn't play hardball along the way, and maybe he did some smears, but I'm talking about when they would send something his way, he would just send it right back at them, never really apologize for anything that he said. What I think the problem many times with, when we think of, again, I want to make the distinction between the right and the left and between Republican and Democrat, because there are Republicans that I would consider as being leftist. They have an R after their name, but they really are leftist. One of the old tricks in the political book is if you don't have success with one letter after your name, you jump ship and put the other letter after your name, and you'll have a lot more success that way. You may have the same policies in mind, but you now have an R after your name, and people are like, "Oh, you have an R after your name, I want to vote for you." It's been that way. A lot of people have jumped ship. Sometimes they've jumped ship for actual ideological reasons, and they truly have jumped the ship, or they've gone to the other side because they have saying, I don't really believe this anymore. Or the Democratic Party that I grew up with and that I was a part of is no longer there. It's now more along the lines of what is the Republican Party. So I'm going to go over there because they're more friendly to me than the Democrats right now. But the problem is that when they do that, again, the left fights unfairly almost all of the time because that is their ethos. Their ethos is, and that comes from the and justify the means. You can't have a rational conversation with a leftist and expect that they're going to play fairly. You can say, "This is what I believe." "Oh, you believe that?" "This is what I believe." But you can't expect even to talk them into it unless they have a come to Jesus moment. They're not going to change their mind, and they're not going to fight fairly.
So you say that, and the normal response, I think, would be, we just need to play harder. We need to break some rules. But I just don't think that's the case, because if we did, and I feel like some people have even tried to, but today we even see it just a few days ago when that guy was arrested. Not a few days ago, I think it was a couple months ago now. There was a guy arrested for quote, trolling Hillary Clinton supporters.
Oh yeah,
end quote. And now we're at this point where we're just openly arresting political opponents, and I think that's a huge reason why you don't see conservatives come together, because they're afraid they're going to be arrested and thrown in jail without any trial in sight down the line. And even the Capitol rioters, they're still in jail. They have they don't know when their trials are. They've just been in there for a couple of years now, ever since Biden's been elected, and there are still people that went to the Capitol riot, and are still being arrested because they're either being found out, or people are telling on them from leftist family members, being like, "Oh, yeah, this guy in my family, he went to the riot. You should go arrest him." And it's hilarious how easily you can betray a family member for your ideology.
It sounds actually like the scriptural description of the last days. It really is amazing to think that those things are happening in the United States. Although, when you go back in history, there are things that have happened in the United States that we really think, "Oh, holy crap, I can't believe that this happened." Like the internment of the Japanese during World War II and putting them in the concentration camp. Was it the death camp that was in Germany or Austria? No. but they were put into a concentration camp in it was the Northwest area. I think there was some in California. I think there were some in either Oregon or Washington. But those things, if you say that would the United States ever put people in concentration camps, most people would be like, no, I don't know. Well, it happened during World War II. Mm-hmm. It was a Democrat administration that did it. And a lot of people were really in favor of it at that time.
And that's a big topic. Like today, if we went to war with China, would we do the same thing? I don't think we could. Like, just think of just the backlash that would come from that, especially from the left. And I don't think that would be a thing we should do. I think both people on the left and right from it, but it would be more emphasized on the left. But I think there are some things that are necessary, especially in war and in a culture as diverse as ours. That doesn't mean if we go to war with China, round up every single Chinese person, but even today there are spies from China in our government, and we know that, but there's just nothing being done about it. And it's either because A, it would be racist to do so, or B, we're not doing it because they're paying us off. The Chinese government's paying us to not say anything. And there was a politician, I forget what his name is right now, but I think he's still in his political position. He slept with a Chinese spy.
Swalwell?
Yeah.
Eric Swalwell?
Yep, that was him.
Yep.
Chinese spy ties. Yep, it was him. After. Yeah, he's a Republican as well. Which surprises me because Republicans are, the ones that are like super hard against China.
But that's the thing. Again, that's why having an R after your name is no guarantee. That's what's so difficult. And honestly, I tend to steer people away from politicians altogether. In fact, I don't even think that that voting does what people think it does anyway. And even if it does, let's say that all the elections are clean for both, the 2016, the 2020, let's say that both of those elections were clean. You don't know anymore who you're actually voting in. You know just some little dance that these people have done and have done for you. And so, I remember Marco Rubio, everybody thought he was going to be one thing before he got in. He's been some of that, but a lot of other stuff since he's got in. That's a perfect example because they thought he was going to be the next chosen one.
I can't even remember the last time I heard about him.
And he has, there are some things that people who voted for him probably would agree with. There are other things that are like, I wouldn't have voted for you if I had known this. You just don't know. And part of the problem is I think DC is such a complete cesspool, but also when you go to Washington, you have to compromise your principles somehow. That's what I think is part of it. I really believe you have to compromise your principles because even in the quote-unquote bipartisan, the way it is now, you look at the last, that bill that was passed that was for the, was it the Affordable Care Act? I don't know if it was the Affordable Care Act. I'm trying to think of the exact bill, but when Nancy Pelosi said, well, we have to pass it to see what's in it. That's the state of our politics right now. You don't even know what's in it that people are voting for. They're getting thousands of pages a couple days before they're supposed to vote on it. And there's very little debate, if any, on some of these things. And all of a sudden, these things go through. Part of the problem is that I think there are some decent people who get caught up in that swamp. And yes, it's that swamp. It is a swamp. Before Trump came on the scene, and it's always going to be a swamp. It's the nature of politics.
And with the names of bills, it says one thing, but it's thousands of pages. It has all of these other things they want to put in. So that's completely unrelated to the name of the bill, and they use that against politicians or right wingers. Really, I think Like the bill there was one in Florida that basically took all of the LGBTQ stuff out of like the curriculum, and it was called "Don't Say Gay" bill. But what it would have actually done, it was called Florida's Parental Rights in Education Act. Yeah, it doesn't even say gay anywhere in the text. Yeah, it would the bill would prohibit the instruction or discussion of sexual orientation. That's basically all it did. But a bill could be labeled, and this is it's a huge issue. It could be labeled "Feed All the Homeless Children in America" Act or bill, and it could be about sending $10 billion, and it could say send $10 billion to Ukraine, and people will vote against it because they don't want to send more money to Ukraine, and then people will say, "Oh, you're against feeding homeless children in America? Oh, you're evil." But that's not actually what the bill said. Yeah. And I would be all for making a limit on how long a bill can be and restricting what can be talked about. It has to be related to the title, which I don't know why there isn't a law for that.
Because it works for both sides.
Yeah, I know. It absolutely does. It's convenient. The same as lobbying not being illegal, not in the sense of informing politicians, but paying them off kind of lobbying. But there's a whole other plethora of issues. But that's when it comes down to bills, that's the biggest issue. It's not in terms that most people understand. It adds a bunch of things that aren't even in the title of the bill, and I don't know if it's just today or in recent years. Has that ever happened before, from what you can recall?
I don't remember that it was. I remember, but I don't remember that it was like it is today. It may have always been thus, because I don't know if what was in the bills was as available. Like now, you can find so much on the internet. I mean, when I was growing up, there was no internet. So you could possibly find out what was in the bill, but you'd have to go to, somewhere. And I don't even know if our local libraries had them. And I grew up in Baltimore City, and so we had big libraries. Maybe there we could have looked up what was in the bill, but then again, you're still dealing with having to probably deal with hundreds of pages. Now it's thousands. Maybe it was thousands then. So it's hard to know. It really is. I don't remember it being advertised like that in the media. So
for all we know, and I'm not going to go out of my way to read every single bill that's ever been passed. So for all we know, that could have been happening forever, because there was just no law.
It's very possible. And I think
you could also say that it just wasn't necessary back then. Maybe people were a little more honest back then, and there were definitely people who weren't honest throughout all time. But there probably just wasn't as much as a need for a law like that.
Absolutely. I think, I think some laws have changed. So one of the things I think that would, if you're going to ask me what would fix the government, the first step I would do is I would make a term limit on Congress to 1 term, period. And not only that, but you would have to take a term off if you were going to try to run again. Because one of the problems that has always been there is that it has become a career instead of, it's not public service. They love to say they're public servants. They aren't. They are public scam artists who
career politicians.
They are ones who, honestly, there are some people in there who have never worked an honest day in their lives, and they will never work an honest day in their lives because they've spent their whole life in Congress. But they spend a lot of time campaigning, doing whatever's needed campaigning, pressing the flesh back at home, not necessarily knowing what their constituents need, but pressing the flesh, doing whatever's needed to get elected again. And you have people like that whole, I don't know if you saw that list of people who have the richest people in Congress, and I can't even remember who was number one. It wasn't even Nancy Pelosi. A lot of it came out, and a lot of people on the right were saying, look, see, there are all these people. But it was as many Republicans, or maybe even more Republicans, as there were Democrats. And they conveniently can make trades, stock trades, that are making them millions of dollars or preventing them from losing millions of dollars right before something happens.
I don't think politicians should be allowed to trade, period.
I would be fine
Be
with that as well.
Be that crypto, be that regular stocks, trade options, it doesn't matter. I don't think politicians should be allowed to, public servants they call themselves,
I would be
should
fine
be allowed
with that.
shouldn't be allowed to trade, period.
I would be fine with
Because
that.
I think that just that alone would take out so many people that are just in it for the money.
Yeah. It's a cushy position in every single imaginable way. It really is. It's a cushy position. You don't even have to do much. You don't even... honestly, you look at most of the people who get into Congress and their ambition far exceeds any kind of talent that they actually have or skill that they actually have. And so their ambition is what gets them there. Their ambition was what keeps them there. And you don't have to be, we look at the AOC, that AOC kind of effect where there was an old movie called Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and he was supposed to be an average guy who ends up going to Congress. That was kind of what they tried to make up with her, but that even isn't really the case. She was kind of, I believe, bankrolled there. But most of the people who even have some kind of real quote unquote pedigrees don't even belong there, and quite frankly, again, may not have ever worked an honest day in their lives.
Yeah, there's a lot of people like that. There are some honest politicians that actually want to get things done, but I think for the most part they get in there accidentally, like it wasn't meant to be. Like especially with Donald Trump, they wasn't expected, and I think that played a huge part in why the election. I'm just gonna say it wasn't honest. It wasn't honest, and whether what you believe or not, you just don't earn tens of thousands of votes overnight, instantaneously. It just doesn't happen. But whoever the political elite are, they did not expect him to win, and I think that can be said for more than just the position of president of the United States. I can think that can be said for a lot of positions. It's just not in a lot of. If it's happening on that big of a scale, like what's happening in our communities, like what politicians don't belong there because it wasn't the will of the people.
Well, I think that that's an excellent point. But how many politicians, quote unquote, belong there because they've been voted on, especially locally, because nobody knows who they are?
I feel like we did cover quite a bit. We went from the time when you were growing up to politics today, and kind of where we are in general. So
I think that.
So we're gonna end it because I can do what I want. So we covered everything. I feel like we covered a lot of good stuff. So yeah, any closing thoughts?
No, I just think that we have to be careful about jumping into the Democratic Republican labels or taking them at face value, because I don't even think nowadays the divide isn't even among that at all. It's, again, I think somebody, and that's not my statement, but two wings of the same bird. I really think that's the case, and so it's something that we have to be careful of. But because I think what started as this idea of political correctness, and they may even say it was started as a satirical thing, kind of a self-referential joking thing. It became very serious in the 90s, and it became the thing that kept pushing society further and further apart. So the right got further away from the left, and now we have what we have today.
Labels, right? I don't really like to associate with any label, really, but I do vote Republican. I don't like to say I vote Republican. I don't believe in parties in general, because as Washington said, don't make parties. And then we did it anyways, and now here we are. and it was a huge mistake, just making parties in general. But I just think that's the natural way of politics in general. Having parties is, I think some people see, or most people see, as necessary to align yourself with a set of beliefs.
Well, I think part of it too is that it's become in some ways a sporting thing. So it's my team versus your team. And the third parties are just some scrub team that you're never going to do. If you vote for them, you're throwing away your vote. And that's it. And that might be true in the whole scheme of things. I understand that. But, the idea, if you're going to vote. And I don't know, honestly, I have never voted for a Democrat. But if there was a Democrat that I saw that actually was honest and I thought was going to fight for America and all and do whatever I thought, I would be more inclined to do that. I just can't imagine that happening today.
Right, I just don't think
because of the schism.
I brought it up last episode. The Overton window just keeps shifting every year, and I just don't think it's possible. So I think that wraps it up. So next time, I think we're going to be talking about what I want to is talk about AI and its future. So stay tuned for that. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for listening.
Bye-bye.